August 7th, 1942, 6:13 a.m. The USS Quincy opens fire with their pounding 8-inch guns on a remote island in the South Pacific. This was the beginning of what will become one of the most significant battles in the war. This was the beginning of a nearly 6-month battle that would turn the tide of war in the Pacific theater. This was the beginning of the Battle of Guadalcanal. Flashback, 6 months ago. The United States had stopped the Japanese advance west dead in its tracks at the decisive Battle of Midway. Even though the Japanese suffered tremendous losses, including 4 of its prized aircraft carriers, they did not believe the war was lost. After Midway, the Japanese turned their attention to the invasion of the Solomon Islands and began to construct a huge airfield on the island of Guadalcanal. When the commander of the Allied Pacific Fleet, General Douglas MacArthur, was informed of the airfield, he sent the entire fleet to bombard the islands and seize the airfield. Guadalcanal was truly the first Allied offensive in the Pacific. Also, this was the first time in the Pacific theater that Allied air, ground, and naval forces would work together in unison to accomplish a common mission. On the morning of August 8, 1942, a day after the initial attacks, U.S. Marines had little trouble successfully seizing the airfield on Guadalcanal. They renamed it Henderson Field. The Japanese launched many counterattacks to try to retake it. These attacks led to some of the most ferocious fighting in the war. On land, an entire division of U.S. Marines battled some of Japan's most battle-hardened troops. In the air, American Wildcat and Japanese Zero fighters fought to the death while dive bombers and torpedo bombers attempted to sink each other's ships. At sea, the most decorated ship of World War II, the USS Enterprise, dueled with the mighty Imperial Navy to gain sea supremacy. The Guadalcanal campaign soon became a classic war of attrition. In February of 1943, after nearly 6 months of some of the bloodiest fighting in the war, the Japanese pulled out of the Solomon Islands. After Guadalcanal, both sides were greatly impacted. Combined, the two sides suffered 40,000 casualties, lost 70 ships, and had 1,400 downed aircraft. However, the Japanese did not have the industrial capability to replace its ships and aircraft, and they had a much more difficult time than the Allies replacing their highly regarded veteran crews. Winning Guadalcanal gave the Allies an important toehold in the Pacific and a vital airbase from which they could launch strategic air raids against the Axis powers. The Japanese offensive thrust was halted and ended all Japanese expansion attempts. Strategic initiative in the Pacific was now truly with the Allies, and after this battle, Allied supremacy in the Pacific was established. The victory at Guadalcanal convinced President Roosevelt to reconsider America's Europe First policy. Now the Allies were on the full offensive in both the European theater and the Pacific theater. From a psychological standpoint, the Allied forces had a far greater optimistic view of the Pacific War. They had just beaten Japan's best land, air, and naval forces. Many argue that this battle was the first step in the long march to Tokyo that ultimately led to the Japanese surrender and the collapse of the Japanese Empire. But what would have happened if the Japanese had won the Battle of Guadalcanal? What would have been the result? First off, the Solomon Islands were located at the heart of vital shipping lanes in the South Pacific. Winning the Battle of Guadalcanal would have given control of these shipping lanes and of the entire Pacific theater to the Japanese. But this was just the beginning. Because the Solomons were located only 1,200 miles off the coast of Australia, the Japanese would have had no problem launching medium bombers from the airbase on Guadalcanal to strike Australia. These bombing raids would have been the first step in an all-out invasion of Australia. The Japanese naval, air, and ground forces were superior to those of their Australian counterparts. To the Allies, a Japanese victory at Guadalcanal could have potentially meant the loss of Australia to the Japanese. However, going so far as to say the Japanese and the other Axis forces would have won the war would be a stretch. To overcome the industrial might, technological superiority, and sheer numbers of the Allied forces would have been a daunting challenge. Just like the Battle of Guadalcanal, World War II turned into a war of attrition. It was clear that the Allies had access to far more resources and manpower than the Axis forces, and like in any war of attrition, the side with more available resources wins the war.